Welcome, everybody, to another one of our Art on Thursdays here at the Chelmsford Public Library. Our host tonight is Jane O'Neil, and we're going to be talking about Maxfield Parrish. Working in the first half of the 20th century, the New Hampshire artist Maxfield Parrish skyrocketed to success as an illustrator with his distinct saturated hues and neoclassical themes. His prolific career helped to shape the golden age of illustration in the United States, and his fantastic landscapes and ethereal figures transported audiences to other realms. This program provides an overview of the artist's life, inspiration, and artistic output. And our host for the evening, Jane O'Neil, holds a master's in art history from Boston University and a master's in education from the Harvard University Graduate School of Education. She is a New Hampshire native and has worked at some of the state's most esteemed cultural institutions, including the League of New Hampshire Craftsmen, where she served as executive director, and the Currier Museum of Art, where she held the role of senior educator. Jane founded the Courier's Alzheimer's Cafe and led the tour program for the museum and the Frank Lloyd Wright designed Zimmerman House. She has taught art history at the college level for more than a decade, most recently at the New Hampshire Institute of Art. So without further ado, I will hand it over to you, Jane.
Thank you so much. And good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for joining me, especially on a big news night like this. I know you could be tuned into your cable news right now. So I appreciate you taking the time to spend it with me and to learn a little bit more about Maxfield Parrish. And you won't be disappointed. Tonight's program is filled with beautiful images, and I will admit a lot of salacious stories. So we are in for it together. Maxfield Parrish painted these beautiful, realistic paintings that inspired imaginations and these beautiful places where innocence sort of seemed to reign. His paintings were in tens of millions of American households by way of reproductions, and this longtime New Hampshire resident was one of the most successful artists of the 20th century. There's so much more to learn about him, right? Okay, let me give you a sense in terms of how we'll spend our hour together. We're going to get started with an introduction to Maxfield Parrish, just a little overview of who he was and sort of how he got going as an artist. And then we'll turn our attention to the Cornish colony, which is really the reason why Maxfield Parrish came to New Hampshire and then ultimately was so inspired by New Hampshire. We'll take a look at the artist's process, including his famous Parrish blues, and then turn our attention to this subject of myth and whimsy. He was considered the master of make-believe, and we'll see how that plays out in his paintings. We'll turn our attention to landscapes and light after that, and then wrap up on some of the key players in Maxfield Parrish's story and see if any of them ended up living happily ever after, ... question mark. Okay, so just another gorgeous example of Maxfield Parrish's painting on the screen here. We won't be getting back to this one, but it is just a feast for the eyes, isn't it? Okay, let's get started with an introduction to our artist. We can see two images of young Maxfield Parrish here. He was born in 1870 to Quaker parents in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And even though he wasn't a practicing Quaker through his adult life, there are perhaps some elements of Quakerism that might have influenced him. One of them being the fact that he never sought the spotlight, really. He never wanted to talk about his art, and he never really wanted to be in the limelight. He never wanted to be really interviewed about what he was doing. The pictures sort of spoke for themselves, and he sought peace, although he wasn't necessarily creating it. In his 20s, shortly after getting married, he took his paternal grandmother's maiden name, Maxfield, as his middle name, and then he later on adopted it as his professional name. So he went from Frederick Parrish to Maxfield Parrish. It sounded a little bit more exotic and certainly more artsy. So that was a choice on the part of the artist. Now, he got his early training from his father, who we can see over here on the left. That is Stephen Parrish. And Stephen Parrish was so committed to his young son's artistic education. He started training him as early as the age of 3. And then when Maxfield Parrish was in his teens, his father said, "We're going on a grand European tour as a family." So what we're looking at on the right is a letter that Maxfield Parrish wrote to his good friend Henry while he was traveling around Europe at the age of 14 years old. And I love this letter because you can see a couple of important things. First of all, he had beautiful penmanship. People sort of gush over his penmanship. In fact, I met someone recently who collected just items that Maxfield Parrish had signed because his penmanship was so beautiful. In addition to that, we see an early interest in cartooning. Certainly, there's all these wonderful drawings here. And then notice the way, too, he even overlaps the letters of the name Hen, his friend Henry. And this interest in overlapping things will play out throughout his career. Okay. So one of the things that happens while he's doing this European tour as a teenager with his parents is that he is exposed to the great masters of art. He goes and sees Michelangelo and Rembrandt and all of that, loves it. But he also goes to Italy and he sees classical ruins and villas with neoclassical sculpture and statuary and architecture. And he is so moved by that. And we'll see how that gets integrated into his artwork throughout his life. What we're looking at here are two images that he created much later on because he was later paid to go back to Italy just to do illustrations for an Edith Wharton book on the subject of Italian villas and architecture. So that was in 1904. These are much later, but he saw these at an early age and it stayed with him. Now we're looking at a colorized photograph of the young Maxfield Parrish. He was very handsome. That plays into all of this too. He studied architecture for 2 years at Haverford College. He went on to study art at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts. And then at his father's sort of prompting, he went on to study essentially commercial illustration at the Drexel University with Howard Pyle, who was a preeminent illustrator at the late 19th century. He would also go on to train other illustrators like N.C. Wyeth. So Howard Pyle was the perfect person to train with. And Maxfield Parrish was on this path to become a commercial illustrator and found some immediate success. What we're looking at here on the left is it is actually his first magazine cover design. Obviously, it's the Easter cover of Harper's Bazaar from 1895. And we can see it's sort of got this Art Nouveau flair to it with these elegant women in their black and white patterned dresses. And of course, Art Nouveau is sort of all the rage in Europe at the time. But over the course of his career, he would do illustrations for a number of publications, everything from Collier's to Hearst's to Scribner's to Harper's Bazaar and Life magazine, as we can see on the right here. And during this time, over the course of the next few decades, his style for these magazine covers dramatically changes. So he goes from Art Nouveau to realism, sometimes to caricature, to realism. We get a little bit of a mix of that with the Life magazine. It's another Easter cover, and he's giving us a smiling Humpty Dumpty here. But we also see this wonderful Maxfield Parrish light in the background. It's a little preview of things to come later on. Now, in addition to working on all of these cover illustrations, which admittedly will not be our focus tonight, he was also financially buoyed by the fact that he was illustrating books too, a lot of children's books in the early part of his career, including Arabian Nights that we can see an example of over on the left, and then like his last great book illustrations were for a book called The Knave of Hearts in 1925. It has been called the most beautifully illustrated book ever made. If you'd like to see more of that, you could probably check it out of your local library. But for tonight, we're going to focus on mostly mythological paintings that he did later on in the 20s, and then landscape paintings. So let me introduce you to some key players in Maxfield Parrish's world. The first is Lydia Austin, who would become his wife. He met her when he was an illustration student in Philadelphia. She was actually his teacher, though she was 2 years younger than him. And she was a beautiful woman, and he wooed her in that same year that he got that first magazine cover. He also married her. Curiously, just a few days after their wedding, he went and traveled to Europe by himself. And he's writing her all these letters about what he's seeing and what he's experiencing, completely, seemingly unaware that he was on a honeymoon by himself. This is a little bit of foreshadowing for you. Now, the couple went on to have four children, three boys and a girl. We can see Lydia over here in a sleigh, I'm sure, in northern New Hampshire with two of those children. But that doesn't mean that things are uncomplicated for the Parishes. Shortly after the birth of their first son, the Parishes hired a 15-year-old girl for help around their house. Her name was Sue Lewin. We can see her here on the left. And she would go on to become a model and a muse for Maxfield Parrish, who we see on the right, for the next 50 years. And I will mention that she was about 20 years younger than Maxfield Parrish. Now, Sue Lewin was from rural New Hampshire, and she was one of six kids. She had very limited experience when she walked into Maxfield Parrish's world. But we can see her here modeling in a photograph that he then translated into a painting. And the very first painting that he created with her image in it was called The World of Make-Believe, or The Land of Make-Believe from 1905. How perfect is that? This was a cover for Scribner's magazine. And that is exactly what Sue Lewin was walking into. The Parishes were educated and successful and sophisticated. They were a completely different world away from Sue Lewin. And so here he immortalizes her on the cover of this magazine. Here's the total finished work here. And we'll be talking about all of these design elements over the course of the evening. But here we see the Grecian urns, the giant columns, the abundant flowers, and a sun-kissed rock face way out here in the distance. And this is a style that, of course, Maxfield Parrish would become most closely associated with. Now, keeping on the subject of Sue Lewin for just another minute more, just to scandalize you just a little bit more, Maxfield Parrish set up residence in his art studio, and Sue Lewin actually moved in with him so that they could work together more closely. Not long after that, his wife Lydia started taking long international trips with their children. But the townspeople from this very, very small town in New Hampshire where he was living, they were kind of scandalized by this. And a group of them approached him, went up to his door, and tried to kind of get information and maybe intercede on behalf of this young local girl who was maybe being taken advantage of. But he insisted that the nature of their relationship was completely platonic, as did Sue Lewin. She famously said, "I'll have you know that Mr. Parrish has never seen my bare knee." So she remained his assistant, his model, his housekeeper, his friend, and almost certainly his lover for the next 50 years. And she was a part of life there. Maxfield Parrish's grandchildren would refer to her as Aunt Sue. So here we're looking at a photograph of Sue Lewin posing for a painting called Griselda. And this is a 1909 Maxfield Parrish painting. The story of Griselda comes from European folklore, and it's the story of a peasant woman chosen by a king to be his consort. He then casts her out for many years, but she remains faithful to him. It's an unbelievable parallel to the actual lives of artist and muse here. Now, that's not all, if you can believe it. In 2013, a leading Maxfield Parrish scholar named Alma Gilbert published this book, a book of love letters between Maxfield Parrish and another woman who he had an affair with from 1936 to 1941. So he had a very complicated love life, to say the least. This woman was 40 years younger than him, and as far as I know, she never posed for pictures. Okay, but let's get back to the art as we finish up this introduction to Maxfield Parrish. What we're looking at here on the left is an example of of the type of illustration that he was doing for calendars at the time. In this case, Edison Mazda, which was like the forerunner to General Electric. So he would create this beautiful image that would be the image for the calendar for the entire year, and you would tear away the month. And then a lot of people keep that image in their homes for forever. They would frame them. So this was the golden age of American illustration. This is when innovations in printing technology allowed for the mass reproduction of art images. And now art was well within the reach financially of the average American. And Maxfield Parrish was able to exploit that in such a smart way. So he made these paintings for these calendars. They were reproduced in the hundreds of thousands, and they were sold at the time for like $1.25. Um, Maxfield Parrish was really the first artist smart enough to copyright his work and license images of his paintings for one-time use only. He said, other artists paint a picture and just sell it. I paint a picture and use it as a calendar, an art print, playing cards, a greeting card, and a puzzle, and then I sell the painting. I sell my paintings 5 or 6 times. And that means that by 1910, he was so successful, he was earning $100,000 a year, when on average it cost about $2,000 to buy a house. So he was richer than rich, really, and obviously very smart and very good looking. So he was living on top of the world, and he called himself a businessman with a brush. All right, so let's turn our attention now to why Maxfield Parrish moved to New Hampshire, a beautiful place with very creative people. And that brings us to the Cornish colony. Okay. So if you've never heard of the Cornish colony before, I guarantee you now you're going to be planning a trip up to Cornish, New Hampshire this summer. The Cornish colony in Cornish, New Hampshire was founded in 1895, and it centered around America's most successful 19th century sculptor, Augustus St. Gaudens, who we can see here in a 1904 painting by fellow colony member Kenyon Cox. And Augustus St. Gaudens' very stately home in Cornish, New Hampshire, you see over here on the right. This is a National Historic Site, and it's available for you to go and visit. There's wonderful examples of Augustus St. Gaudens' work there. Now, St. Gaudens passed away in 1907. The colony endured on until about 1920. And during that 25-year period, more or less, there was about 100 artists, architects, dancers, actors, and even a US president who would journey up to New Hampshire's Upper Valley every summer to create and to socialize and to just create unforgettable times, really. So it was about a 9-hour train ride from New York City to get up here. So once you're up here, you are pretty committed. So here we see Maxfield Parrish, also painted by Kenyon Cox. And he began to visit Cornish, New Hampshire just before the turn of the century because his father was already involved with the Cornish colony. So writing from his parents' home to a friend, he said, "It's such an ideal country, so paintable and beautiful, so far away from everything, and a place to dream one's life away. I long to be up there and to become identified with it. It is a paradise up there in the mountains. I hate to think of the city again. Ever. Outdoor life has changed me in many ways." So in 1898, Maxfield Parrish looked across the valley in Cornish, New Hampshire, and he saw a grove of oak trees in the neighboring town of Plainfield, New Hampshire. And he went and he bought the land and he started building a cottage for him and his wife, Lydia. And this is that cottage under construction, probably at a later stage of construction that we're looking at here. So this is where he and his family lived. These are 2 photographs of Maxfield Parrish with his kids, and his family, along with other families that stayed in New Hampshire throughout the entire year, were called chickadees because apparently those are birds that are that are hardy birds that can withstand the cold. So Maxfield Parrish was here in New Hampshire year round, and they became very prominent members of the colony. It was sort of like Augustus St. Gaudens, and Maxfield Parrish was right underneath. So when the First Lady of the United States of America, Ellen Wilson, went to visit the Maxfield Parishes, this is what she wrote to her husband, the President of the United States, in 1913. I just came back from visiting the Maxfield Parishes. The menage is charming in every respect. In the first place, they are all so good looking. He is really a beautiful young man and charming too. And Mrs. Parrish is lovely. She has 4 beautiful children and is evidently a devoted mother. She was an artist herself. So here are the Parishes living in this remote rural part of the country, but they were in very good company. Their home, their property was called the Oaks because of these massive oak trees that were on the property. They are some of the oldest and largest oak trees in New Hampshire. This one here is actually tied for the largest. It's more than 19 feet around. It's hard to really get a sense of the scale here. So I visited this property a couple of years ago, and I have a photograph of it with my mother standing next to the tree, and you get a sense it is a massive tree here. And it's a tree that found its way into his paintings. It inspired his works. So we're over here on the right, we have a 1909 mural by Maxfield Parrish. This is just a detail of it called the Pied Piper. It's in a San Francisco hotel bar, believe it or not. But that massive tree in the backyard, in the background, I should say, is no doubt inspired by what was in his backyard, right? So here is the Oaks as it looks today. Maxfield Parrish had expanded it from a 4-room cottage into a 15-room like manor house with 5 bathrooms. It was part clapboard farmhouse, part Italian villa, part English manor house. And the actual building that he built burnt down in 2013. So we're looking at a little bit of a replica here. It's pretty close to what was originally there. But throughout the time he was building his house, throughout the time he lived there, Maxfield Parrish prioritized this view of Mount Ascutney in Vermont, which you could see just across the valley. So this is the view from his house. It's actually an old extinct volcano. And that view found its way into a lot of his paintings. So here's a work that's at the New Britain Museum of American Art. And you can see it's sort of a callback to his own property, to his own experiences here. And we'll be talking more about these kinds of landscapes in just a little while. I did just quickly want to note too, that the parishes had an extensive garden. All of the Cornish colony thought of their gardens as like an outdoor living room, and it was really Lydia Parrish who had the green thumb here. They all had neoclassical features in their gardens too, including this little round pond here, which kind of finds its way into this later painting from 1926 called Golden Reveries. And in fact, elements of his garden and his neighbors' gardens were always in these paintings because they all loved these vaguely neoclassical elements to them. Here is Maxfield Parrish standing in his own garden with this giant sort of Grecian-inspired urn behind him. And you can see he's using something sort of similar in this work from 1918 called The Garden of Allah. So he's featuring these kind of vessels that are like an easy shorthand, a way to tether these pictures to a neoclassical past, while other elements like the lighting and the costumes, etc., suggest this like mythological dream world. But let's keep in mind this idea of a set and a neoclassical past and costumes, because this is where the Cornish colony gets really interesting. Are you ready for this? In 1905, in order to celebrate Augustus St. Gaudens's 20th anniversary in terms of his time in Cornish. 70 colony members, along with townspeople, held what was called a masque for him. And a masque would be like a type of theater entertainment that goes back to like the Renaissance. And it's usually performed for a royal court. There's singing and poetry and dancing. And this particular performance that the Cornish colony did actually made national news at the time. So the Cornish masque had all of these elaborate costumes that you can sort of glean from this photograph, and obviously the neoclassical scenery here. And this was all the stuff that would punctuate Maxfield Parrish's paintings. And of course, he was integral to putting on this performance. Believe it or not, he himself was actually a part of it, dressed as a centaur. Unfortunately, I don't have a photograph of that, but he did paint a centaur just a couple of years later in 1908. And we can probably safely assume that his model for this picture, called Jason and His Teacher, was wearing Maxfield Parrish's own centaur costume here. So it gives you a sense of the theatricality of this group, which leads us to the fact that they decided to have a stage set installed in the Plainfield, New Hampshire town hall. It still exists there today. And Maxfield Parrish designed the stage backdrop in 1916. It has 6 wings here, so these elements that sort of come out on the side, and then 3 drapes. It has these beautiful fall colors, and we can see Mount Ascutney again and the Connecticut River. And it actually has its original lighting, red, amber, and blue, and the lighting can change to give you the sense of the passage of time over the course of an entire day. This has been called the most beautiful stage set north of Boston. I can't wait to see it in person someday. So this gives you a sense in terms of the context for Maxfield Parrish's paintings. Let's go get a little bit better acquainted with how he would make his works. We're just going to kind of zoom through this section here, but Maxfield Parrish actually had tuberculosis in the year 1900. And so in order to recover from that, he went to Saranac Lake and then later on to Arizona. And with all this time that he had to recover, that's when he really started experimenting with glazes and that sort of thing. We'll talk about that in just a moment. But I think it's like also when he begins to see these rocky cliff faces that he becomes so enamored with, and this orange peach light that he illuminates them with. This is actually a much later painting of Arizona, but I think this is when Arizona sort of gets in his soul. When he gets back from Arizona, he decides that there's way too much distraction in this giant manor house that he has built. So he builds a 15-room studio 40 feet away. And that's where he kind of sets up shop, because now he's got all of these complicated processes for making a painting. So this is an extensive building. We can see a more contemporary photograph of it over here on the left. And this building is not only a place for painting, there's also a machinery shop in there. He called himself a machinist who loved to paint. And the studio also had 3 bedrooms, a kitchen, 2 painting rooms. One of them was for oversized pieces. It had a trap door in the floor so he could easily move murals in and out, 2 bathrooms, and a dark room. And so photography would become really integral. And so I just to emphasize too, this is actually the building that he lived in with Sue Lewin for the next 50 years, just 40 feet across the lawn. So photography, as I said, was really important to Maxfield Parrish. And I think that this is the first time in any of my talks, I think, that we are looking at an artist's nude selfie in terms of a photograph, because he would use photography to plan his pictures and essentially to insert those photographs almost directly onto his works. So in this case, he's modeling for his own finished painting, which would be called potpourri. But for the most part, he would use other people as models. We're looking at a work here, not with Sue Lewin, who was his primary model, but with a young woman named Kitty Owen. She was actually the granddaughter to William Jennings Bryan, who was the Secretary of State and ran for president 3 times. We're going to see her again in just a little bit. But the way Maxfield Parrish would use photography is that he would use a glass plate photography and then a magic lantern so he could project the image on the glass plate onto paper or board, usually paper, and then essentially trace the image of a figure and then cut it out and then oftentimes apply it to the surface of a landscape. So in this case, you can see Kitty doesn't look fully integrated into this painting called The Canyon from 1923. There's this sense of three-dimensionality in the work that is really kind of fascinating, but it oftentimes comes from the fact that he is applying works to the elements of the picture, oftentimes figures, to the surface and then varnishing them in. And these figures have a photographic quality to them because he is so closely and mechanically tracing them in. Now, he also didn't want to just paint Mount Ascutney, so he would build these little landscapes in his studio using these creating these little stage sets oftentimes, but he would find these giant rocks, usually quartz, because the rock elements would shine so nicely in the light. So he would shine a light on them and put them on top of a mirror and get like that great reflective quality that you so oftentimes see in his paintings. This little set that he built is oftentimes associated with this painting called Romance. I don't really see a great one-to-one connection here. And there is actually another painting called Romance where you see more of these craggy rock outcroppings. I think that this is a better one-to-one connection that we see from his little built piece to a finished work like this. We can also see another built set in this painting called Mill Pond. And in this case, putting this little stage set that he built on a reflective surface just works so well in order to create this cool, placid pond, this reflective surface in his painting. And so you can't always tell, but you can sort of make a guess here that he might have cut out and applied to this canvas everything from sort of that center line down. It does seem to kind of emerge out towards us in an interesting way. So now we get to Maxfield Parrish Blue. Parrish Blue, and this is an element that he is probably best known for. And the way he would achieve this beautiful blue was he would oftentimes take pure pigment, just cobalt blue, and drag it across the top of a white board, and then laboriously using a stippling brush, drag it down. It's sort of like a violent act to bring that color down. He wouldn't dilute it with any white paint. He wouldn't mix in the white paint. It's just bringing that pure pigment down towards the horizon line here. And he would usually work one color at a time and then add layers of glaze and varnish. So the glaze had thin layers of very vivid color in it, and then varnish was like a clear a varnish. And so this was a very time consuming process. Sometimes the varnish would take like 2 weeks to dry. So he was oftentimes working on multiple paintings simultaneously. Now, this is all like a historic process. This goes back to the Renaissance, but nobody was painting like this in the 20th century because you didn't have to. But Parrish really liked the end results, this kind of glistening surface that he had, and of course audiences did too. So let's turn our attention to this world of make-believe that he was creating for his audiences in the first few decades of the 20th century. We can see with these two works that sort of have similar compositions here. We have air castles on the left and the dinky bird on the right. These paintings show Parrish's very special talent for creating these neoclassically inspired fantasy worlds that are accessible to the general public. And he would punctuate these fantasy worlds with these idealized academic nudes. These are not threatening nudes in any way. You don't see any genitalia, you don't see any body hair. And sometimes they could even kind of read as androgynous, but they would help to make these scenes appear timeless. And blowing bubbles and swinging on swings, these are quintessentially innocent childhood activities. And he would set these activities against these kind of dreamy medieval hilltop cities. And they would be these ethereal fortresses, right? But we know that these were all parts of sets that he was building. Now, he would sometimes directly reference children's nursery rhymes or stories. This is actually a massive mural that he painted for John Jacob Astor IV. And this is 1906. This is based on the British nursery rhyme, Old King Cole. And when John Jacob Astor commissioned this, he had one request, and that was to put his own face as the face of Old King Cole here. Apparently, Maxfield Parrish didn't really like being bossed around because he played a little trick on John Jacob Astor, apparently. But just to give you a sense in terms of how much he was paid for this mural, which measures about 8 feet high and about 30 feet long, it was the equivalent in today's money of about $130,000. But the trick here, the old joke, the saying is that he painted Old King Cole as if he has just passed gas. And so you can see, let me see if I can sort of zoom in here for you. Various figures have paused and they look sort of astounded by what they're smelling and what they've heard. So Maxfield Parrish was clearly someone who wasn't afraid to ruffle a few feathers. This brings us to The Lantern Bearers, which is really, I think, one of his most beloved works. It's at the Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art down in Bentonville, Arkansas. It was painted in 1908 for Collier's magazine. And it's just so striking because we have this sense of these golden lanterns that really do seem to illuminate what almost seems like a theatrical setting here, right? Against this parish blue night sky. Now, there are 6 lanterns here, but there are also 4 other golden orbs in the background. Maybe this is the moon over here. So there's a little bit of mystery as to what is going on. And then we have these 6 figures, these clowns. They're known as pierrots, which is like a stock comic French character from like pantomime. And pierrots are a symbol really for putting on a mask for one's true feelings. And that is just so appropriate in this case because the person that posed for all 6 of these figures was none other than Sue Lewin. And we can see her here adopting that same pose as the figure on the far left. So this idea of masking your true feelings. It seems to come out in quite a few of his works. Now, this next image that we're looking at was actually on the cover of the Ladies' Home Journal. This is not an image by Maxfield Parrish, but it is about Maxfield Parrish. We are looking at the ladies' dining room in the Curtis Publishing House building, which was in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And in the early years of the 1900s, you wouldn't let all of these women go out and have lunch in the city. They were sort of cloistered in this building on the very top floor. And Maxfield Parrish was paid to create a series of murals for this space. And you can just sort of get a sense of the scale. They are these kind of golden sections within the wall here. This is really Maxfield Parrish's most ambitious cycle of murals. They're all 10.5 feet high. The largest one was over 17 feet wide. Let's take a quick look at them. This was a series that's called the Florentine Fete. It's a series of pictures really about nothing but sweet nothings. There's no narrative here. We see a few more of these pierrots, right? So there's no hidden meaning. It's just these characters in this kind of fanciful dress, the neoclassical settings, right? This could be a garden wall in Cornish that might have inspired this. Now, there's close to 200 figures over the course of the entire cycle of murals. Sue Lewin posed for more than 150 of them, apparently. Maxfield Parrish posed for a few of them himself. This is a self-portrait of the artist looking much younger way over here on the far right. Now, if you're dying to see these works, they have been permanently installed at the National Museum of American Illustration, which is temporarily closed, but when it reopens, it gives us all a reason to go down to Newport, Rhode Island real soon. Now, this brings us to Maxfield Parrish's most famous work. I'm sure you've all heard mention at some point or another of this fantasy land of Daybreak from 1922. This would be his most popular print ever. And unlike several of his other paintings that we've seen tonight, it was created to be a fine art print. So he was working with a New York company called the House of Art. And even Parrish referred to this as like his great painting. It's the epitome of his work. It was so successful and reproduced so often, it's estimated that a reproduction of this painting was in 1 out of every 4 American households. It's hard to imagine, right? Now, like I said, despite this, he refused to talk about it. So we're going to sort of delve into it in interesting ways to try and understand it a little bit better. I wanted to show you this kind of sketch photographic study that he did for it. Now, in this early rendition, we can actually see 3 figures here. There's like the standing nymph, the girl lying down, and then a third figure who's like seated next to this column over here. Now we know that the standing figure was the artist's 11-year-old daughter, Jean. The figure lying down was Kitty Owens, the granddaughter of William Bryan's Jennings. And this probably would have been Sue Lewin, who was kind of getting on in years. Now, the setting here is so closely related to his life in Cornish. This is a photograph from a little book on Cornish, New Hampshire, and you can see it's almost like the same setup. It's like these women in neoclassical clothing. Maybe they were going to go perform at that masque, sitting along a pool. Drew Barrymore, the actress's famous I think it's her great aunt, who was also an actress, Ethel Barrymore, had a house in Cornish, New Hampshire. And it was like the same thing. It was like this pergola covered marble pool where people would sit like this. So this was the sort of thing that Maxfield Parrish would see in his life. But he was also thinking of something that kind of wonderfully related to that stage set that he had already created in downtown Plainfield, New Hampshire. So he's conceiving of this magnum opus painting as integrating all of these previous ideas that he's sort of been batting around even since he was a teenager. So why does he move from 3 figures to 2? There's a couple of different ideas about this. And the most compelling, I'll say that the one that I find least compelling is supposedly his 11-year-old daughter asked him to take Sue Lewin, that third character, out because she sort of understood the interpersonal dynamics there. But as I understand it, Maxfield Parrish's children were somewhat oblivious as children to the true nature of the relationship there. And what I find more compelling is that Maxfield Parrish was interested in the golden ratio and Fibonacci sequences. And so he's created essentially that wonderful, almost like a nautilus shell that in terms of his composition that leads our eyes directly to those 2 figures and that wonderful interaction between the 2 of them. So let's talk a little bit about, and if you're interested in Fibonacci's sequence, it's basically this idea of expanding space based on numbers. You would add 2 numbers together, 5 and 8, to get 13, and then 8 and 13 to get 21, and it would expand, and the area would expand in that predictable way. So let's go back to the painting itself. Okay, so what we're looking at here, we have this androgynous nymph standing over this young woman who has apparently been sleeping on what looks like an ancient Greek temple floor all night. The nymph seems like the personification of daylight itself, and so she greets the daybreak with this smile as though she's greeting a lover in the morning. Parrish never fully acknowledged the sexual appeal of his art. It is what one art historian described as the power and erotic energy within the dream of purity, which I think just kind of uh, encapsulates this so well. Beyond them is that still water, that Parish blue, right? And then those rocky mountains that look a little bit more at home in maybe Arizona than in New Hampshire, but it's got that beautiful peach light and then the purple shadows there. It's a pleasing composition and subject, and one that has been appropriated in a number of ways over the years. One of my favorite movies, The Princess Bride, you can see one of the versions of the movie poster is a callback to Parrish. There is also several album covers, music album covers that refer to Parrish's painting, including the Moody Blues and the Allman Brothers. Are you ready for this? Even a Nestle candy bar campaign of white chocolate referenced Parrish's paintings. And then none other but the king of pop himself, Michael Jackson, did a video with his then wife, Lisa Marie Presley, where they were the very figures in Maxfield Parrish's painting. That was back in the early 1990s. So even though this was done in 1922, obviously it had some staying power, some real influence on American culture, and it sort of spelled out what the rest of the decade of the 1920s would be like for Maxfield Parrish. He focused on these idealized neoclassical young women, or sometimes nude women, who were oftentimes just situated on improbably rocky outcropping. So there's this idea of how soft and innocent they are and how rough the terrain is. The figures were photorealistic, and the landscapes highly detailed. But by 1931, Pear said, I'm done with girls on rocks. I painted them for 13 years. This has become tiresome for me. So he said, a man can only repeat himself for so long. So right around 1930, he gives up the subject, and gives up a subject that was very financially profitable for him. So he turns instead to just landscape and light. And I think that a lot of Maxfield Parrish fans today really especially love these landscapes that are so oftentimes inspired by New Hampshire. This is a painting called New Hampshire Hills from 1932. And so now we see Parrish focusing all of his attention on light and the landscape itself. Oftentimes you get these beautiful complementary colors between the lavender of the mountains and then this beautiful sort of ochre yellow in the foreground. Sometimes there's a quaint little cottage or barn, but in this case, it is the detail of this rock outcropping and this lovely summer day here. Everything's idealized. We've got the mountains, the rolling meadows, the grand oak trees, and the humble little barns. So these jewel-like colors, I think, just kind of pull us in. We don't need the girls on the rocks. There's enough here to kind of feast our eyes on. And sometimes Maxfield Parrish just decides to focus in on a massive tree. This one's called Autumn Brook from 1948. It doesn't have the classical columns of daybreak or any of these imagined mountainsides that we saw from his make-believe pictures. But here, all he wanted to do was just focus on this play of light on this massive tree trunk here. And you hardly even notice the autumn brook here because you can barely look away from this gorgeously illuminated tree trunk in the foreground. And now that you've seen this, you're going to be seeing Maxfield Parrish tree trunks everywhere you go. I was eating dinner the other night and I like ran outside because across the street, my neighbor's tree was all lit up like this. And I felt like a fool snapping pictures of it. But once you see it, you appreciate it and you begin to see this beauty in the world that maybe you hadn't seen before. So Parrish continues on like this throughout the 1930s into the 40s. Here is his painting of these massive birch trees. He called this old white birch from 1937. And here you can see that maybe because of those massive oaks in his own on his own property, he could really imagine any tree as being monumental in proportions. We get this almost octopus-like tangle of trunks and branches here. We've got this incredible blue-green sky with just a little bit of yellow at the horizon line and this gorgeous peach light on those branches. He considered this one of his very best paintings. Here's a photograph of the artist later on in life with the painting just behind him over his fireplace. Now, continuing on with the subject of the white birch, here is another take on the same subject. And Maxfield Parrish can really turn any landscape into a beautiful one. Here we have these beautiful white birch trunks and branches set against this golden sky, kind of flirting with these lavender mountains in the background. But the subject and the layering of these elements here, to me, once again, recalls that stage set that he had created back in the 19 teens. So this idea of layering and this attraction to nature was always within him. So we'll end this quick look at his landscapes with these last two works, these last two winter works here. Parrish had a talent for capturing this quality of light that's only present for a few minutes a day. Later on in his life, he was asked a question about like how he finds inspiration. And this was like the one question where he was candid and he was really able to talk about what he did. He said, up in this northern wilderness, when nature puts on a show, it is an inspiring one. There seem to be magic days once in a while with some rare quality of light that hold a body spellbound. In sub-zero weather, there will be a burst of unbelievable color that when a mountain turns deep purple, a thing it refuses to do in the summer. Then comes the hard part, how to plan a picture so that it gives to others what happened to you, to render and paint an experience, to suggest the sense of light and color, air and space. There is no such thing as sitting down outside and trying to make a portrait of it. It lasts only for a minute, for one thing, and it isn't an inspiration that can be copied on the spot. I think he's copied that light so effectively here. I should say he captured that light effectively here. And I draw your attention to these little orange windows over on the right. This is like another Maxfield Parrish signature element. We've already seen it in a few of his pictures. We can see some glowing windows on the left as well. With those glowing windows, I feel like he creates this sense that you're almost home. It's like you're trudging through this home and you're almost back to the ones that you love who are waiting for you. You're almost back to warmth too. And it just beckons you, doesn't it? Beyond these glowing mountains here. So in our last few moments, I want to give you the epilogue. Did everybody live happily ever after? Okay. Um, put on your seatbelt because this is quite a story. All right. Despite being profoundly wronged by Parrish in their marriage, Lydia Parrish sort of found her happiness. She would do annual trips to St. Simon's Island in off the coast of Georgia to escape the New Hampshire winters. And believe it or not, she ended up doing ethnomusicologist work there. She even published a book called Slave Songs of the Georgia Sea Islands. Now, she died of cancer in 1953. She was 81 years old. And at the time of her death, she had been married to Maxfield Parrish for 58 years. Now, most of that, they really were not together, right? Because he was with Sue Lewin, who we can see at, I think this was a photograph taken of her in the final year of her life. Now, Sue Lewin had been waiting all this time for her chance to marry Maxfield Parrish. But I think as a Quaker, or maybe it's just as somebody who was really nervous about attracting any negative attention to himself, he never wanted to divorce his wife. So he just lived in the studio with Sue Lewin. And after his wife died, Sue Lewin waited patiently for another 7 years for him to pop the question. And when he wouldn't, at the age of 71, she decided to leave Maxfield Parrish. He was in his 90s at this point, and she went and married a teenage sweetheart that she had, believe it or not. So this caused an interesting ripple in the relationship between Sue Lewin and Maxfield Parrish, because then he went out and he changed his will. He updated it to include Sue Lewin's new married name, and he put her essentially at the top of this new will. And he bequeathed her exactly $3,000, which is basically nothing considering she was his companion and did everything for him for the previous 50 years. Um, so there's all sorts of speculation as to why he did that, and maybe it did actually mean something to the two of them. But a few years after both Lewin and Parrish had passed away, construction workers actually found some photographs that he had taken of her in the nude. We already knew that they must have existed because he painted her in the nude. So this idea that he had never seen her bare knee was just not true. So the story of Sue Lewin and Maxfield Parrish was ignored for many years. Believe it or not, one of the first primary biographies on him only mentioned Sue Lewin in one sentence. So Sue Lewin passed away in 1978, and she was interred alongside her husband in a cemetery in Plainfield, New Hampshire. So Maxfield Parrish passed away. Well, he painted until he was 91 years old, I should say, and his career spanned 65 years. The image on the left is called Getting Away from It All. It was painted in 1961, and it was actually the artist's very last work. It has all of these familiar elements, right? His style essentially didn't really change over 65 years. And even through all of these modern art movements, think he's painting at the same time as Picasso and Pollock, he just stays steady. So this painting is really thought of as like a goodbye from the artist. We've got this single little house located near all of these magnificent mountain peaks here, and it is surrounded by winter snows that are tinged by the approaching dawn. And even though art historians sort of like to focus on this beautiful setting here, I think that there's something about this snow-capped little house here with the light still on inside that really seems like a self-portrait of the artist as well. So in his later years, Parrish developed severe arthritis in his hands that prevented him from painting. He passed away at the age of 95 in New Hampshire. Just before he died, he was quoted in the New York Times as saying, "I don't know what people find or like in me. I'm hopelessly commonplace. Current appreciation of my work is a bit highbrow. I've always considered myself a popular artist." So we end tonight with just sort of a peek back in terms of considering how his work has influenced so many over the years. It's a part of our visual culture, even if you didn't recognize it. It's on everything from Elton John music covers to US postage stamps. Maxfield Parrish created a romantic world of wonder enjoyed by people of all ages and of different ages, really. I mean, it's withstood the test of time. He painted graceful maidens in classical gossamer gowns and rarefied mountaintops, castles, and villas. And he stirred the imaginations of his vast audiences. In the end, it seems that the only thing to truly capture his heart was the rolling hills, the majestic trees, and the atmospheric light of his adopted home state of New Hampshire. So I will end there for now, and I welcome any questions or comments you have about Maxfield Parrish. I will start looking at the Q&A here. Someone asked, what was the first magazine I showed that was done in pen and ink? Strap in, we're going to get a little bit of whiplash. We'll go all the way back. That was Harper's in 1895, the Easter cover there. And you know, looking back, you can even see some of those little hilltop villages that are going to become really such a familiar part of his body of work. Larry asks, what medium did he usually paint with? Oil. Oil, that's correct. Yes. Linda Holt says, where can we see some of his paintings? A great place to see his work is at the National Museum of American Illustration in Newport, Rhode Island. They're currently closed for renovation. I'm not sure when they are reopening. It doesn't have that information on their website, but they do have an email address. You can reach out to them. It is on their websites. Karen says, two quick questions. Did his Parrish blue and painting techniques have any influence on later artists? I'm not sure about that, to be honest, Karen. Apparently, it was very laborious. You can go onto YouTube and you can see some people doing like Maxfield Parrish demonstrations, and it's very time consuming. And he didn't invent it. It was a process that existed before him, but I'm not sure anybody else kind of took up the mantle after him. Your second question was, will his use of varnish cause color on originals to change or deteriorate? That's a very good question too. As far as I know, I don't think so. I'm not sure. The varnish that he used was clear. We oftentimes think of like old masterworks being varnished and then it kind of turns a little bit brown. His was clear. I do think that it caused a fair amount of like cracklature on the surface of the works, which has been problematic in preserving them, but I'm not sure if it discolors them at all. Great questions, Karen. Someone else asked, do you have a sense of whether Parrish's inclusion of fantasy figures in his early works was more for commercial appeal or for his own self-expression? Great question. I think it was a little bit of both. I think he was involved in this really interesting community in Cornish, New Hampshire that somehow sort of inspired and spilled out onto his paintings. But then maybe after painting that for a couple of decades and having there be such a demand for it, and it was like the same thing again and again, I think he got a little bit tired of it. So it seemed like it was tied to self-expression. It was certainly commercially popular, and then he just had to move on. What year did he die? I believe that was 1966 for Anne Sullivan. And somebody else asked, who controls the Parrish estate today? Great question. I am not totally sure, but I believe Alma Gilbert, who wrote that book about those secret letters that I referenced, she's written a number of books on Maxfield Parrish. She had actually moved onto his property and was trying to turn it into an art museum for several years after his death. I think she has a lot of, or she had at least a lot of control over the estate. Um, so I'm not sure where things stand today. Did any of his children become artists? Yes, he actually had a son named Maxfield Parrish Jr., who you'd think would become an artist, but as I understand it, his boys sort of gravitated more towards like engineering machinery as he had, and his daughter Jean had become an artist in her own right. David and Cindy, thank you so much for your kind words. Somebody else asked, does the first picture of Sue Lewin show Lydia peering at her? First picture of Sue Lewin. Oh, interesting. Going back to the land of make-believe here. Well, it's hard to say. Actually, I almost suspect that is Sue Lewin twice, because he wasn't afraid to use her as multiple figures in a work. And it seems as though after Lydia had a baby, she was just too busy for modeling, or maybe was not the type of figure that he wanted to paint. I'm not sure. Ron asks, is the Oak site open to the public? It is, because it is an Airbnb. You can go and stay there, which I think would be very, very cool. You can literally just Google Maxfield Parrish Airbnb and you can go and check it out. But when you stay there, you're staying in like another building that's on the property, not in the rebuilt house or in the studio. But I've met the guy who owns the property, and he was very generous in terms of showing me around when I went to go visit. Laura asks, there was a theft of a number of panels many years ago. Were they ever recovered? Thanks for asking that, Laura. I'm going to show you those panels. They have not been recovered. They are still, I think, on the FBI's top 10 most wanted stolen works of art. And here they are. They were a part of a major mural commission that he did for the prominent arts family, the Whitneys, and they were in a gallery in Los Angeles, and I believe they were cut out of their frames and stolen. So these would probably be worth several millions of dollars. Kathleen says, "Is there no museum dedicated to his work?" Nothing. Alma Gilbert did try to get that going right there on that property, but for whatever reason, it didn't work out. And Sharon, I got to the question about his children. Ellen asks, as his children got older, how did they feel about him living with another woman? It's so funny. And just what I've gleaned from the books is that there was no sense of any impropriety really when they were children, at least. But one of the sons had been talking to a shrink when they were a little bit older as an adult. And then they just had like this realization, oh yeah, it makes sense. Dad was having an affair all along. So it doesn't seem as though they harbored any ill will, and it seems as though they accepted that if they were going to go visit their father as adults, that they would just be visiting with Aunt Sue as well. Very interesting, huh? And then Jan asks, please mention that the Courier Museum in Manchester, New Hampshire has a wonderful Maxfield Parrish painting. Yes, absolutely. That's a great place to go and see a parish. Also up at the Hood Museum, I mentioned the New Britain Museum down in New Britain, Connecticut too. There's some works that are sprinkled around out there, but Courier is probably pretty close for most people. Thanks for mentioning that, Jan. And I'll start looking through some of the chat here as well. And let's see. Oh, it's great to see where everybody was, a few people added where they were from tonight. And looks like people enjoyed this. Thank you, everybody, for your kind words. I think I got to all of the questions. I really appreciate everybody joining us tonight, and have a great June. We're practically in June now. And I'm so happy to say that I will be in Chelmsford for our next talk. I'm going to do it live. On June 27th, we'll be looking at the work of Frida Kahlo at 7 p.m. So I hope you can join me for that presentation. It would be so wonderful to see all of you in person. And again, thank you, thank you, thank you so much for joining us for tonight's program. I really appreciate everybody's kind words and great questions. Have a great night, everyone. Take care.